Here we are in Texas again. We're on the White Shaman site. It's a fantastic story we're going to share with you. And Mr. Jim Zingraff, and he has a fantastic book. We'll be telling you more about that, of many years of work that he has done on many various sites along the Rio Grande and in this area. Jim, thanks for having us. We're looking forward to this day with you and seeing these wonderful sites. And I must say, I have a copy of your book myself in my library, and I certainly enjoy it.
Well, good.
Thanks for allowing us to come.
Now you've got some walking ahead.
All right.
This is called a leather stem plant, and the Indians used to use it for healing. Sometimes called, see, when you cut it, give me your hand. If you have a cut,
Oh, yeah.
put that on there,
Yeah, I've got one.
and it just, it puts like a Band-Aid on it, so it keeps it clean, but it also has healing.
Well,
Then if you can cut a piece like this and trim it a little bit, and if you got a real bad toothache, you put that in your mouth. Just put it where there's a tooth. Chew on it, and it'll kill the toothache.
well, isn't that something?
If you can take a piece of this, touch the end of your tongue, all the feeling in that end of your tongue will disappear. That tip of your tongue becomes dead.
For how long?
So it's, a minute or so.
Until you get to the dentist.
But that's what, it was a medicine that was used out here. See, it's also called dragon's blood. If you cut it at the right time of the year, which is usually in the fall, it's too late, and you cut it low to the ground, it'll bleed red blood.
Well,
And that's where it gets the name dragon blood.
well,
It puts on a green leaf. If we get a little rain, it would come real quick, but right now it's pretty dry. It puts on a little flower about as big as the end of your thumb. It looks like a little orchid. It's the most beautiful little flower you've ever seen.
well, and what is the name of that now?
Formosan dahlia.
Formosan dahlia.
And it just blooms beautifully.
Well,
There's a lot of things out here do that, in all this roughness and ugliness, there's a lot of beauty. This is a Spanish dagger, and this is what the people made their cordage out of. If you take this and dry it, and then pull these runners off, after it gets real good and dry, I've actually pulled a car with it.
well,
You can take it 5 strands and braid it. It takes, when it's dry, it works better. But after you've braided it into a rope, I can't do it right now, and you put enough of it together, you can't break it.
Oh my.
I've done one about that long and wrapped it around the hailer hitch of a car and pulled the car with it.
Well.
And that was their rope, or they cut them finer and made sewing fiber out of it,
Well.
where they could actually sew leather together. It makes a fine thread.
That fiber seems very strong.
Yeah.
Well.
They would dig it up and cut the roots off of this plant and this plant. This is a sotol. And at the base of the sotol there's a cabbage. It's much like a big artichoke.
Well.
And they dig a hole in the ground and build a fire in that hole, get it super hot, pull the coals back and bury it, let it stay that way for a couple of days, and then open it up, and it was like eating an artichoke or
Wow. And the name of this was
lechuguilla.
Lechuguilla.
And this is sotol, and they're both very edible and very high in protein. The deer, if it gets dry enough, the deer will come up to that and take their front paws and knock it down and get down to that cabbage and eat it.
Well.
When man tries to alter Mother Nature, you can see how low the water is, but that used to be a lake, and of course on the other side of that bluff is the Rio Grande, so the Pecos runs into the Rio Grande, and with the current running into a current, it made an eddy and accumulated the dirt and mud. I think half of New Mexico is laying there. It all came down the Pecos River, and that mud is about 60 to 80 feet thick now, and it's stopped everything. Terrible. They're real rare, and that's awful big. Most of them are about that big around. They're little bitty. And there's they grow in little clusters. That's
They're kind of bunched in there,
Yeah.
aren't they?
There's a plant out here, I'm sure you've heard of, called peyote, and it does the same thing. It'll form a little cluster,
Ah.
and it comes from the roots. The new ones come from the roots. The roots will spread out and it'll come up someplace else. I don't think they'll bloom that small, but the peyote does the same thing. We don't have any around here. But that little plant, I've had a canteen and poured the water on it, and within an hour or so it'll start opening and turn green.
Well.
It's called a resurrection plant.
Resurrection plant. How interesting.
It's an interesting, here's quite a bit of it.
Here's a better shot, Michael.
See how it dries up? Just completely dries up, and then the slightest bit of moisture, it'll blossom out and just be beautiful. See, the water's pretty and green, and you can see our fence that we put around
Oh,
the
yes.
site, which is later on when the trees grow, it's kind of disappears.
Well,
But it's
good to have the protection.
well, it has to be. It's ugly, but Mike, right below you is a good example of how old this country is. You see the shells?
Yes, sir. Oh, yes.
That's about 400 million years old. Some of the guys that are experts tell me it's not shell, it's more like a piece of moss there. Out here we have a distinct 4 types of petroglyphs, paintings on the wall. The oldest is where we're going to look at the Pecos River style, and that's supposed to be 8 to 10,000 years old. We have not found any that dated that far back, but we have found some that go back 4,000, 4,500 years. One of the big questions that I've always had is, if the people were here 10,000 years ago, and we know they were, why did they go almost 5,000 years without painting, and then all of a sudden they started painting? It's a question that we probably never find the answer, but it's interesting. Then after the Pecos River style, there were 3 other types of paintings that came along. The red linear, which you might not have seen, and we can't show you any here, but it's little stick figures. And then the red monochrome, which is, this is a red monochrome. They're a lot cruder. They seem to be emphasizing the activity of a group. They always identify the sex, and they're always done in solid colors with no added color. If you see here, that's a man, and you can obviously tell. And then there's some other figures that have been erased off the wall and then never colored. Down here there's a great big tall figure. That's an individual, and here are man and woman, I assume holding hands. These paintings are not near as old as the Pecos River style, and for some reason or another they got more crude and less detailed the later they got. The old ones are much prettier and much more in detail. The 4th type of pictograph out here is a historical site, and again, I don't know if y'all have seen any of those, but they usually have a horse or a cow involved, and they've got Spanish conquistador with the big hat on and the vest and the flock. And also on the historical, there's usually a church with a cross on top of it. So it was the first introduction to Christianity. These are important. One of the fascinating things about this site that we've never been able to figure out, and I had a lot of archaeologists talk about it, but nobody, if you'll see the grinding holes,
Yes.
they're little cupules, and they all go to a point, and they're all small. There's one down here somewhere that's pretty big, but most of them are small. And most of the grinding holes we find are 3 or 4 inches in diameter and pretty deep. These are the most shallow and oddest shape that's out here. Also, the good example, we'll see some more of it up on top, but these people were naked for most parts. They wore very little clothes, if they wore clothes at all. And sitting around on these rocks, if I take my pipe and rub it on my cheek, my pipe picks up a gloss of human wax. And if you feel that rock, you can get an idea of how long somebody's been sitting on it.
Oh, yes.
And there's a couple more there. And then upstairs we got a good example of it. Here's a great big figure that's very hard to find. You have to look at it for a while, but see the guy's head comes to a point, then he's got arms in some kind of arc, and then he comes down. He was clean, but never painted. And again, there's no way of knowing why. Imagine that'll be hard to see in a camera. On this guy's right hand, right arm, you can see the fingers, and he's holding something over his head like so. I can't imagine why they would paint some and some they didn't. There's an awful lot about this culture that we don't know anything about. And one of the ambitions of the foundation is to continue research and study to try to be able to interpret and understand what they were saying when they put those on the wall. The cactus, it's the closest one you get to when they got big, they put on these spines with the hooks on the end. And in sites that we've dug, we've actually found 3 of those tied together to make a triple hook. So we're quite sure they were used for fishing, and hence the name fishhook cactus. We had a man that bought the property for us, Mr. Galloway, and he furnished this pipe, and the National Park Service actually came here and put the fence up. They did all the work and furnished this wire. All we did was grind the pipe for them. That's when the lake was full, and they brought a boat up here, a barge, with an electric arc welder on it, and brought it all up through that brush and built this whole thing. They did a heck of a job. There's a good example of a site where people lived. You see all the, what we call the spoil or the midden, the small rock that pours from it. The people that lived there carried the rock up and used it for cooking, and evidently just threw the rock out the front of the... And at a distance with a pair of binoculars, that's how we find a good site to work and research, by the amount of talus slope that comes from the opening of the shelter. There is no pictographs in that one, but it's a good example of a site. The grinding holes, you can see the difference between these and the little ones you looked at down there. If you had enough time and you had grass seeds, didn't take you long to grind either pigment or grass seeds. You'd wear out your staff before you wore out the hole. We'll talk about this site, which I think, and others, that it's probably the most important site out here. This was like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. It was very definitely a religious site. It was a demonstration of their faith. It was a page out of their Bible. It answered all the questions that people couldn't answer. Where do we go when we die, or why did this happen, or why did that happen? And they could come here and get the answers. I don't think this site was ever lived in a great deal, because we don't see any talus slope. There's a little bit down there, but not much. I think this was more of a home for a particular person in the beginning that wanted to answer all the questions, was probably a gifted person, was an artist, was somebody who was just a little bit above the normal group in his intellect and his intelligence. So he came up with, based on the history that they brought over from Siberia, they enlarged on it, and although most of it is very fundamental as to what they brought over from Siberia, they enlarged on it, and almost the same situation we have today. We have a lot of evangelists running around the world today, and 2,000 years ago there was only one. So it works that way. We found this site in 1952, and I'm not saying that other people hadn't seen it before then. Some of the ranchers out here probably had. But in the early times, when the state archaeologist and myself and a couple other people were looking for as many sites as we could to try to record them before the lake was built, and some of them were covered up, we came down this canyon. And of course, at that time, there was nothing but the Pecos River there, which was a very narrow, small river covered with cane. And we were going around, and one of the boys that was with us said, "Hey, there's a good site around this bluff." And I said, "Well, how about that one up there? It looks to me." And he said, "No, there's nothing up there. It's not a good site." And I argued with him a little bit and said, well, I'm going to go up there and find out. We didn't have any steps there, and it was a little tough getting up here. But I did, and they went on around. And when I came up here and saw it, I let out a wah-hoop that they could hear, and they came running thinking that I'd been bitten by a rattlesnake. And later I told them that I felt like I had. That when we came up here and found this site, we've been arguing about it and talking about it and thinking about it ever since. At that time, I never believed, not for a minute, that I would have something to do with this site being preserved and owning it. I told Cliff last night, I don't own it, but I feel like I do, because I was here in the beginning, and the gentleman that bought this 400 acres was up here. He was standing right there, and I told him my interpretation of this site, and he had a tear in both eyes, and he said, hey, Zencraft, why don't you go buy that? I said, well, I can't. It takes money to do that. He said, I'll give you the money, you go buy it. And sure enough, we, after dicking with the property owner for a while, we finally made a deal with him and bought the 400 acres. And there's more in this 400 acres than we ever dreamed of. There's lots of sites. There's lots of areas where these people spent their days and their weeks in their life. And this is a site that's very different. You've seen Panther, and at Panther you saw a great deal of painting, and a lot of it was over painting, and a lot of it was painted at different periods for different reasons. Where we sincerely believe that this site has virtually been left alone since it was put here. If you notice, there's a white line, starts with black down here and then changes to white and goes all the way through, all the way to the end. We believe that that white line gathers this site into one story or one page. And it was kind of a warning to everybody that, hey, we don't overpaint this site. We don't add to it. It's one story, and we tell that same story. We know it had something to do with people of importance. We have a crown right here, and we find this particular motif in a lot of sites. And we believe is the same thing that they crowned the kings with crowns of glory. It's basically the same fundamentals. You got to remember, these people thought and acted just like we do. They didn't wear many clothes, and they didn't have television sets and automobiles, but they were human beings just like we are. The same type of people. So they had answers, and they had their political organizations, and there had to be some way to govern these people just like there is today. We might not agree with the law or with the federal government all the time, but we got to have them. They keep order. They keep things going. We might not agree with the direction they're going, but they're there, and they're there to keep order in our culture. That's what these were. That's exactly what these were. I can't tell you everything that they're trying to say here, but I can tell you what I think some of it is. And that's one. If you'll see on top of that crown, there's a man with his arms outstretched. He's got an addle in one hand and spears in the other, and he's got a set of deer horns on the top of his head. He was an individual. We got the same thing on this end. A big crown that's almost gone. Moisture has wiped it out completely. But it's the same thing. It's the theory. The important thing about this site, besides being endorsed by people of authority, is that many of the figures on this wall are dead. They're upside down, and we know from research with the Australians and with the Aborigines in Africa that when a figure was drawn upside down, that was their way of saying, this guy's dead. So we believe that this site deals with death. There's all kinds of demonstrations of that. Here's a man upside down with a spear stuck in him. Another. They're all over. They're upside down, and even the animals. And you got to remember, you see a deer with a spear stuck in it, you got to remember that these people believed that everything was their brother. The animals were their brother. The rocks had a soul. The trees lived. Everything here had feeling to it and had a soul. So Even though that's drawn to look like an animal, it could very well be the brother of the person that put it there. Then we come to what we think is the most important part of this whole panel, and that's the white shaman. This figure is white. There is a few figures out here that are white. I've been fussed at because I said at one time that's the only one that's white. I'll say again, that's the only shaman that's white. In the ceiling of Fate Bell, there's a big ghostly figure that's white, or what's left of white. Down the river and on the right-hand side, there's a figure we call Casper the Ghost. And he's a big fat figure and has white paint on him. This is the only shaman that I know of that has that much white on him. So let's talk about him for a minute. If we figure that black represents man and all his evil and all his devastation of the earth, then we make him black. We stick a spear in him and it hits his heart, and all his energy, his life is pouring forth from his body. He's dying. On his right we have his soul. White has always been considered a color of purity, a color of no sin. So his soul is rising to the happy hunting ground. Look here on his left arm. Here's what you and I would call an archangel. We know that when they put a figure on a wall and put feathers on his body, it gave him the authority to fly. Not that he could stand on this bluff and flap his arms and soar, but his soul, his body could leave its form and go to another area. And so we call him an angel. He's got the man's soul by the left arm, helping it to ascend to the happy hunting ground. Down here we've got death on both sides. He's upside down and bleeding profusely from the head with a spear stuck in this one. So you've got death. You've got three men to one side with their arms raised going, hallelujah, he has risen. You have the same story right here that 2,000 years after this was painted, Christ was crucified. I'm not saying it has anything to do with Jesus Christ. I'm saying that the people of this area asked the same question, and whoever this man was, whoever the shaman was that painted it, answered it in the same way that the New Testament answers that question. Look at it a minute. You got his white body, which is his soul. You've got his black body, which has got a spear in it. He's dying. You've got an angel helping him to rise. You've got death on both sides. And then above it you have the monster. You've all read about Jonah and the whale, or you've heard about King Arthur and his dragons, how often they seek to find and slay the dragon, because the dragon signified all the bad that were. They spit fire, they eat young maidens, they did everything bad. So if a knight could go out and kill a dragon, which there never was a dragon, he would be considered a hero. They never killed one, but they always looked for him. You got the same thing. This is a combination of maybe a big old catfish. It's an eel. You got eels in that water. He obviously went through the water because there's the flapper to make him go through the water. And this culture, like many other cultures of this area, time era, believes that the dark, ugly features of man and life was at the bottom of the water. It was dark down there. It was deep and mysterious. If you went too far, you couldn't come back up and you died. So this is the monster, better known to some people as purgatory. He had to cross through this to get to the other side. This was life. This was represented by the tough life they had to lead. And they had to go through that. They had to make it through that to get to the other side. Here's a guy that's made it to the other side. He's skeletonized. He's obviously dead. He's floating on the other side. He still has his weapons in his hand, but he's on the other side. You've got 6 men that came here to do the same thing, but only one made it. We think that this little circular half circle with the people on it, with no faces, is not the story you hear about, don't shoot my picture because you capture my soul. Has nothing to do with that. Out here there were about 5,000 people at one time in history. in this whole area, which is much more than there is now. They were in small groups. They were in groups of 30 or 40, and they moved around. They came together on special occasions. There's a site that's up this river called Lewis Canyon. It's a big petroglyph site, which we believe it's one of the places they came together once a year to establish a boy to a man, to establish a woman, a girl to a woman. It was also a place where they could meet and change each other's daughters and sons, so there was never any inbreeding in the groups. The most important thing is they were in groups, and we believe that's what this is. They're without face because they didn't represent an individual, but represented a group. This was sacred to all the groups. Why they didn't go all the way around, I don't know. There's obviously a reason for 4. Most of what we see out here is in 3s and 7s, but there's 4 guys here. I don't think there's much overpainting on this site because most of it is pretty well stands by itself, and there's no way we can tell you what any of this means. Here's a man riding a deer. More people upside down. What the guy is that looks like he's from Mars is anybody's guess. I've never had anybody yet that came up with what that could be. We have one lady from A&M that says that these little black dots are peyote. And if you'll notice on the deer head on that figure, he's got little black dots on his horns, which could be the peyote cult. I'm sure they used peyote out here, but I don't think they used it to the extent of becoming fanatical with it. They didn't use it and get caught on it like we see people get caught on drugs today. They used it to help them travel. They used it to find out the answers. One of the interesting things, if you've ever read Joseph Campbell, to me Joseph Campbell was the greatest man in his theory that time has ever produced. He's an anthropologist, not an archaeologist. Joseph Campbell tells a story that I think is really great, and we were talking about peyote, and this is a situation that exists today in Australia and in Africa with the hunters and gatherers. It tells where they had a ceremony, and the shaman was the leader, and for a long time people would come to the shaman and ask him questions. How's my daddy getting along? I need to kill some game because I need the skins for my family and I need the food to feed them. How can I go out there and kill a deer when he's my brother? So there's a lot of answers like that they were seeking. The shaman would dance, take peyote, go without sleep for a long time until finally he fell on the ground completely exhausted. Maybe from the influence of peyote, but most likely the influence of just pure exhaustion. He'd fall on the ground and kick a little bit and lay still, and the people would say, oh, he's dead, he died. And the leaders would say, no, he's not dead, leave him alone, just go away. And he might lay there for 3 or 4 hours, he might lay there for a day. And finally he'd begin to stir a little bit, and the people would come running, because when he came to, he could tell them all the questions they asked. If you want to kill a deer, you go down that canyon and turn to the right and go up that header, and up there you'll find a deer. Well, he's smart enough to know that that's probably where a deer would be anyway. And sure enough, then he would say, well, if you're going to go up and kill a deer, then what have you got to give that's important? What can you trade? What kind of offering can you make? It might be a painted snail, it might be a pretty red stone, something of value to them, and they would trade. Hence came the offerings made to shamans of today that build big buildings. Pay me, give me an offering before I give you the answers. But he would know all the answers, and he probably dreamed, he probably had colored dreams if it was peyote. I understand you dream in color and things are vivid and contrasty to you. So you got all these questions in your mind. You know that people have asked you all these questions. So when you go into this trance of unconsciousness, They're utmost in your mind, so those are the answers that come to you. And you dream about it, and you're able to come to and give them that answer. That's how peyote was used, and if indeed that is peyote, or on the deer horns, then it was used in that fashion. It wasn't used to get addicted. It wasn't used as we know a drug. It was a helping point for the shamans to find the answers. If you'll look real close, and I've been here so many times and I still have trouble seeing it, but some of the significance, right there in front of me are two little deer that are huge. See, there's one right there and one right there. You probably can't see it, but when you come closer you can. And the stories that we pick up when we study these things are really amazing. You've got two little deer, and to the left you have a river. See the river, the rainbow? We know that's a sign of a river. So you got two deer by the river. Maybe that was the answer that somebody seeked, and they went to that spot, found the two deer, and it was worth recording on the wall. It was the answer to his questions, or the answer to your questions from the shaman. I repeat, this is a story in itself. It's a page out of their Quran, their Bible, their code of ethics, what they led, the life they led, and how it was governed. This was the only thing they had. They couldn't write. They had no written language. So rocks and walls were the only place they could put their beliefs and the rules of government. And basically that's what it is. I think the best thing you can do is come up and look at it close and find some of those things yourself. Unless Alan or Paul have something to add to it, that's pretty basically what this site is. It's important. It's worth saving. We've carbon dated this site to 4,500 years. That's a long time ago. You ever tried to imagine how long 1,000 years is? The generations involved in 1,000 years. And the people lived in this area and worshipped in this church 4,500 years ago. That's 2,500 years before the birth of Christ. And the similarity to the story is surprising, very much so. I've had a couple of preachers fuss at me for even suggesting, and I'm not suggesting that's Jesus Christ. I didn't say that. The story behind the resurrection is what I believe it says. And there's nothing wrong with that, because these people had feelings and had responsibilities and had desires just like we do. So there had to be something to gather the people together at certain times of the year. There had to be rules. There had to be a way of life for these people. And I don't think it's hard to buy this at all. The other sites with the other pictographs, there's a big site not too far from here called Rattlesnake. Maybe we can get you in there someday. It's a site like Panther. It has many, many big shaman. I kind of see it like the rotunda at the Capitol, where you've got all the president's pictures hanging on the wall. Well, at that particular site, you've got a dozen big, tall shaman standing there, and each one is involved in something that's going on around them, and they demonstrate that on the wall. Across the river, Diego's place, across the Rio Grande in Mexico, there's a shaman over there that's 35 feet tall. It's amazing how they could get up that high and paint him. He's a great big guy, and his arms are outspread, and he's got all kinds of paraphernalia coming from his arms and hands. He doesn't have a addle or a throwing stick. Some of them do, some of them don't. They've got various types of decoration, and when you compare it, I mean, look at some of the Catholic masses and how decorative those priests get. They're shamans. There's nothing they can be but shamans. And there's different types of shamans that work in different directions, but basically they deal with the spiritual values of the people. just like these people did. If there's any questions, I can try to answer them. There's a lot of questions that can't be answered here. I think the interesting thing is this guy. He's skeletonized. He's got the same long flowing hair. He's got his most precious things in his hand, his spear thrower and his atlatl. He's got a spear stuck in him too. So he was dead. But he's on the other side of the monster. He made it across. And these monsters are in all the cultures. Look at the Chinese, how they worship the dragons. And nobody knows that. I don't think there was ever a dragon. There was a big whale or a big, huge animal that maybe got bigger than the rest of them that they derived. But basically, they made these things up by the most ferocious things they could see. I think this interesting sight, too, because this is one of the few sites out here that does not have a panther in it. These people had a lot of respect, and they communicated with the panthers. It was the biggest, most ferocious animal out here. So it became sort of a monarch to them. And they followed the panther and the ways of the panther. He was cunning, he was smart, he was strong, he had claws, he roared. Up the river, there's two panthers fighting each other, and a little guy in the middle that we call the animal master. This little guy was probably in charge of panthers. He was a specialist. If you had a problem with a panther or you wanted to kill one, you went to him, and he would do this same thing, and depending on the offering you made, he would let you go kill a panther or tell you where it was. So it was all right to take a panther if he gave the okay. And they probably walked for hundreds of miles to come see that guy and get permission. They went on quests, just like the other cultures did. Cultures derive from necessities. And these people had a lot of necessity, and their culture derived from the same viewpoint. If you haven't read Joseph Campbell, you really ought to. He deals, like I say, he's an anthropologist, and he deals with the spiritual needs of the people and the various attitudes all the way from Buddha on. Joseph Campbell was raised a very devout Catholic, and got in trouble with the church on several occasions. But he was able to understand the spiritual needs of the people, and that's what he worked on, and that's how he got there. I think we're all concerned about the morals in our country today and what's going on. That's most of us feel like it's beneath us, and we are concerned about it. Lying has become such an everyday thing, both with our politicians and our bosses, our people of influence. Lying becomes a second way of life. I don't believe a lie would work in this culture. I don't think lying could possibly be accepted. And yet, today in our world, lying is just second nature. Respect for other people. Respect for the man that runs the household, that defends the household against all enemies. Had a certain amount of romance, if you want to say, but certainly a lot of respect. And today, that's gone. We've lost the right to raise children because our children get in trouble, and we're lily white and clean, and we're nice people, and we provide all the necessities for our children, and they get in trouble. Something's wrong. Why can't we go back to a basic culture of right and wrong? I sound like I'm preaching a sermon. I don't want to do that.
Can you tell about the hole in the earth where the people came from?
Well, at Panther, y'all were at Panther, you saw the great big panther on the wall, and beneath him was a little figure with his arms outstretched and feathers on him. And beneath that is a hole in the earth with bright lines coming from it. These people, like the Anastasies, believe that you came from a hole in the middle of the earth. You are the earth. You're part of the earth. You're part of everything around you. So you came from the hole in the middle of the earth. When you died, and in this area there's a lot of what we call sinkholes. They're holes that are 4 or 5 feet in diameter that go down 60 or so feet, and they're there basically to furnish the aquifers with water. It's where the water runs when it rains and it fills up the aquifer. But these people believed it was the hole in the middle of the earth you came from, so back you went. We don't find many burials around here, and when we do find a burial, it's usually a shaman, somebody of importance. And the idea of burying him on the surface of the ground and wrapping him with straw mats, which we found right around this corner, was to keep him here. He was a man of importance, and you didn't want to throw him in the hole because you didn't want to get rid of him. So you buried him on that shelf and covered him up, and you could come back to him at any time. If he wanted to come back to his body, his soul wanted to come back and talk to you. How many times have we all gone to the cemetery to see the grave of our mother or father, and what do? We walk up to the gravestone and talk to him. My dad died not too long ago, and I never go out there that I don't talk to Dad. You know, you look around to see if anybody's watching you, but you talk to them. Well, what difference? It's the same thing. And the burials that we do find, and I know where there's one about 100 yards from where we stand, and I never tell anybody about it, because I don't want somebody to come digging him up. He belongs there. He's part of this site, and he should be left alone. There is a movement now to try to bring back many of the burials that the museums have and put them back where and that's all right. It should be. I think they're better off back in the ground than they are in some damn museum on a shelf. The only problem they're having is that some of the people that claim rights to some of those burials really want the relics more than they want the burials. And if he had relics with him, the relics need to be buried with him, not sold at some auction for big money. And some of these items out here, when found, I know 2 little painted shells like these I've got in my pocket that had pictographs painted on the side of them with a real fine brush. About 2 years ago, went for $3,000 a piece to a collector in San Antonio. He pays big bucks for paleo points, Folsom points, and Plainview point. So when the market's there, there's somebody that'll buy them. There's a little guy in Comstock, Texas. It's the most interesting little guy you ever met in your life, and he makes arrowheads. He sits down and makes an arrowhead. You wouldn't believe it. Beautiful, better than the Indians, better than I've seen. And at first I thought, oh gosh, that's terrible, because he's putting things on the market that are fake. But you know, I believe it's the best thing that ever happened, because some of these big buyers now are real skeptic about buying a pretty point. They don't know if it was made 1,000 years ago or 15 minutes ago. So it's really helping to water down the market and keep some of these things from being sold as relics. The foundation is sponsoring a program right now to try to restore some of the sites. Not restore the paintings, because we can't do that. We don't know what they are. But to keep them from disappearing any more than they already have. A lot of people say that the lake, when the lake was built, the moisture from the lake corroded some of the sites. I don't believe that at all. I saw these sites in the 50s, in this one particularly, and it's no different now than it was 30 years ago. It hasn't changed a bit. If you could paint your house with paint that lasted that long, how great it would be. I painted my house 2 years ago and it needs painting again. How does that paint manage to stay up there? And of course the geologists tell us that it's done with ochre. It's rock, soft rock that's ground in these holes, and then a binder mixed with it. Marvin at A&M, Marvin Rao, has come up with some theories and trying to substantiate that it has a lot of blood in it, animal blood. They actually did a DNA, and they've come up with blood. we've always thought that it was probably mixed with some kind of grease. This is ordinarily pretty hot, and if you rendered the grease out of an animal, put it in the hole and added your ground ochre and then mixed it good, you'd come up with... But the thing that's made them stay is that ochre is rock itself. This rock is very porous. It's limestone. We all know about limestone, how it absorbs the moisture. When you put the painting on the wall, that paint went into the limestone, it absorbed the moisture in that and became part of the rock. So it's not really paint. We shouldn't call it paint. It's rock. It's rock on rock, and rock absorbed by rock, which keeps them from... And the only thing that damages them is you see a little hole right here where sometime in history that turned into a spring and there was water running from it, and the water ruined it. Also, this area that's rubbed off is done by the sheep. The sheep would go up here and start... You can see where they couldn't walk there, but they started walking here, and their wool coat rubbing against the bluff has rubbed the image off, which not much we can do about it. One of the big problems with this area is that when they do get rain, which isn't often, but when they do, the fact that this is limestone, it rains up above, the water comes through the rock, gets behind these figures. Then if we have a really bad freeze like we had a few weeks ago, that moisture freezes and pops the paint right off. We have gone up to sites and found a piece of it laying on the floor where you'll see some of this that's gone. It was probably popped off by a hard freeze. There's a difference between a flake, and over at Panther there's some big flakes in one of the figures that are popped off, and you can see the contour of the rock. This one doesn't seem to have that much trouble. This over here is wind erosion. That's soft limestone, and the way this sits, when the strong winds out here blow against that bluff, it just eats it out. And you can see the fine powder that falls from it on the floor. Some of it's harder than the others, so that's why the wind digs it out in some places and doesn't bother others. That bottom part of this wall is a good example of what limestone... If you took a piece of limestone and put it under a microscope and multiplied the size many times, that's what you'd see. That's the way limestone is on a smaller basis. The holes are much smaller on a regular rock, but they're still there. You can't even see them. There's a certain amount of manganese in this rock, and the water running through the rock secretes a solution of manganese, and the manganese turns gray from the sun. It takes several hundred years to form a very, very thin layer. You can break it off and see the white rock underneath it. The foundation, it's called the Rock Art Foundation. It was established about 5 years ago when a group of people were concerned about these paintings in Valverde County and hoped to do something to bring more education and more awareness of the paintings and how important they were to a culture 8,000 years ago. So they formed an organization called the Rock Art Foundation, elected a board of directors, and put a group together that actively does things in education and in interpretation and preservation to make that its goal. The first really good thing that was accomplished by the foundation was to buy this site, to fence it, and to work on the whole area to try to preserve it. But the most important thing, and the man who put the money up for it said that he wouldn't do it unless we made it available to people to see. The first year that we bought this site, there was exactly 2,200 people that went through it. And up to that point, nobody had ever seen it. So we want to share the work with everybody, but we want to share it under circumstances that preserves it. Our address in San Antonio is 4861 Fredericksburg Road, San Antonio, 78229. Our phone number is 525-9907. We're also on the internet, the home page that you can find us easy enough on the internet. And I can't repeat that number. It's too long for me to remember. But it's not hard to find if you do rock art, prehistoric rock art research on the internet. We appreciate everybody's help. We appreciate you guys coming out here and helping us tell the story. Old Alan down there is always available and seems to enjoy it as much as we do. So you're welcome to call him or to call the foundation office, and we'll do what we can to get you out here.
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been certainly exciting. And Jim, it's been a pleasure being on this tour with you.
Thank you.
And very informative, and a job well done.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting us, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. It's certainly appreciated and will be appreciated in millions of homes in America, Canada, and Central America.
Thank you so much. We're extremely glad to have you.